Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people that can better help us understand human risk, whether that's academics studying human behaviour and how to influence it, practitioners who work to mitigate human risk, or those who have insights about it that I think are worth sharing. My guest this time effectively covers all three of those bases. He's not formally an academic, but he's definitely a thought leader in behavioural science and a well-respected authority on the subject. What might surprise some listeners but seem very obvious to others is that he's someone who works in advertising. Rory Sutherland is the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy and helped set up their behavioural science practice. He's been a copywriter and creative director, but he's also done TED Talks and recently published a book called Alchemy that I've previously featured in my Human Risk newsletter. In short, he's a bit of a legend, so if you're familiar with him, stand by for vintage Rory. And if you're not, then you're in for a treat. Before we begin, a public service announcement. If you're listening to this soon after release in early June 2020, then I do want to flag up that Nudgestock, Ogilvy's annual Behavioural Science Festival, is taking place on June the 12th this year. Normally it's a physical event held at a UK seaside location, but for obvious reasons this year they're going online and they're going global, and it's entirely free. So if you like what you hear from Rory in this podcast, do sign up. There's a link to that in the show notes. With that said, on with the show. If you've heard Rory before, you'll know he's highly expressive, so a word of warning to any listeners who are offended by expletives: neither Rory nor I hold back. Because it's rare to have someone with an advertising background on a podcast that focuses on topics that are closer to risk and compliance than marketing, I thought I'd begin my discussion with Rory by asking him what he thinks of compliance. His answer sets the tone for what's a thoroughly engaging discussion.
So if you come from an advertising background, words like compliance generally fill you with visceral horror, because what it suggests immediately is a kind of box-ticking mentality.
Right.
And one of the interesting things about, advertising is it tends to attract a slightly dissident kind of personality. So you would be very, very unwise as an ad agency having a very strict, laid down travel policy, for example, right, because it will really, really annoy people. And by the way, often I think people are right. There's a fascinating case where I'm pretty sure, I'm just trying to remember who it is. It's someone weird, a bit like Spotify or Netflix, where the travel policy is like one sentence where it says spend the money intelligently as though it were your own.
Yeah, it's Netflix, which is in Netflix's best interest.
Act in Netflix's best interest, which is, the opposite of that is Rod Liddell, who's my colleague on The Spectator, travelled up to the BBC with a BBC colleague. And he meets a load of mates who said, we'll see you on the train for a drink. And they're in first class, having bought first class advance tickets for sort of 60 quid each. And the BBC person says, we're not allowed to travel in first class, and dutifully hands him a full fare second class ticket, where the cost of the return journey is something like 300 quid. And, so if you have that kind of dumb rule where actually it's almost an obstacle to human ingenuity, because it forces you to do a thing that's sort of unintelligent but easy to quantify and delineate. That's the kind of thing that ad people rail against generally. And so the interesting thing is any phrase like compliance would immediately imply to me the imposition of a box-ticking, rigorous procedure on the magic of human instinctive decision-making and action. And I'd have the same visceral reaction to procurement as well, okay? Which is it's all the business of let's pretend this is all much neater and more rational than it really is, so no one can blame us for anything. And blame avoidance is really the driving force of business decision making. It's where individual motivation gets very much separated from best practice. The classic example I always give of procurement is if you have a pitch for advertising agencies, procurement will always hand out what I think they call a balanced scorecard. Okay. And the idea is you assess all the pitches on sort of 7 weighted measures, including chemistry, strategy, creative flair, operational ability, price. Okay. Right. And the idea is you score each agency on all of those things. And then the one that gets the highest total wins. And if you ask any person who's been through that process, if you ask a procurement person, they just want the cheapest one anyway. So that's a fucking question, isn't it, really? That's a mindless bloody nonsense, right? But if you ask anybody, particularly when they've had a few drinks, what did you really do? Did you really add up the scores? Think, now, of course I bloody didn't. I chose who I wanted to win, and I backfilled the numbers. Which is evidence, I think, that the way human decision-making works isn't like that Darwin decision of do I get married, right, arguments for, arguments against, weight them. Somehow the way we make decisions manages to fuse a whole load of non-linear variables. For example, it's stupid if you think about it to make that thing weighted, because if you have, let's say your score for chemistry is 10 out of 100 possible marks. If you basically loathe the people you meet, okay, you're not going to produce any good work with them, okay? In fact, you won't want to meet them. In fact, you'll try and avoid them at every possible opportunity, in which case their scores on the other 90 points are basically irrelevant. And so that business of trying to impose structure for the purposes of self-defense on decisions which should be left a little bit floppier always creates a kind of visceral horror in me. However, I had this wonderful experience where I went to a compliance conference where they'd asked me to speak. And previously, I think you would have had to put a gun to my head to get me to attend the conference. But I turned up early. And within about 3 minutes, I was thinking, this is fascinating. These people are soulmates. Because what I realized, it was kind of advertising in reverse. That whereas we spend our time going, how can we persuade people to do this? This was the opposite. It was, how can I stop people from doing this thing? What incentives, what mixture of incentives, messaging, framing, and other behavioral techniques can you put in place to prevent? And it also interested me because the best rules, I always thought, were probably heuristic rules. There was a brilliant thing in the city for a time, wasn't there, that you had to take 2 weeks contiguous holiday every year.
Block leave, yeah.
The block leave idea. Now, I think that's sort of fallen into disuse, but it's very, very clever because generally anybody can cover up some shit for a couple of days when they're out of the office. But you probably can't cover up your leeson dealings if you're away for 2 weeks. So that's a very, very clever heuristic rule, which is ostensibly at one remove from what you're trying to do, but it's ingenious because it essentially uses an oblique but very, very clear-cut rule, very easy to enforce, which essentially solves the problem laterally rather than literally. And of course, that was where I also saw parallels with advertising, which is sometimes you say, look, in order for a rule to be meaningful, it has to have certain qualities. For example, it's visible when it's broken, okay? It's very easy for you to keep track of it yourself. So the phrase I always use is I always favor binary rules because the human brain seems to work with them better. They seem to train you better. So the example I always use of that is that you feel much, much worse, even if it's 3 o'clock in the morning with no one around. You feel much, much worse driving through a red traffic light than you do breaking the speed limit. Rules, if you look at religious laws, they generally, say things like don't eat pork, don't work on Sundays or Saturdays. Okay. And then, of course, it's and we've done the same thing with rules around health. So we were partly responsible, at least, for promoting the idea that don't just count units of alcohol. The best rule, really, in terms of drinking is don't drink for 3 consecutive days every week.
Right.
And there are strengths to that. Now, an epidemiologist will go, that's impure, because theoretically you could follow that rule and be a raging alcoholic on the other 4. Right? So an epidemiologist would go, no, that's at one remove from my scientific findings. But what you'd say, looking at, say, long history of Lent, Ramadan, religious rulemaking, is one, it's a pro-social rule. So if you don't drink on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday and persuade all your mates not to do it as well, it's much, much easier to enforce because you don't have a load of people going, come on, it's just a half, right? Secondly, if you think about the units counting measure with alcohol restriction, most of the time you'll actually hit your weekly limit when you're already pissed. Okay. Someone failed to spot that, didn't they? One, it was a bit suspicious because the recommended amount of alcohol units was always a multiple of 7 for some reason. Like, is this really okay? But secondly, most of the time you hit your limit, you're 2 drinks in. And the other, you're my best mate, you are, I love you. But I've just had my 21 units, so we must stop. It's not going to happen. And funnily enough, we discovered actually latterly that quite a few hepatologists, because doctors aren't immune to hitting the bottle, shall we say? Okay, it's a bit of a bit of a problem of the field, and a lot of people would go to the hepatologist and say, "I'm a bit worried about how much I'm drinking," and the hepatologist would actually say, "Look, man, I'm not supposed to tell you this. I'm supposed to talk to you about units, but actually, if you don't drink for 3 days a week." A, there's recovery time. B, there's a buffer against dependency and habit formation. So if you find it difficult not to drink for 2 or 3 consecutive days a week, there's a warning sign because you've got the beginnings of either habituation or dependency. And the other one, of course, which I think is worth bearing in mind, is that and this also applies to things like the 5-2 diet, which are also examples of very clever rule setting. So intermittent fasting, the 5-2 diet, meat-free Mondays, all those things. First of all, they make the thing manageable because they're not, their rules applied at a specific time. But also, I think, if you think about diet restrictions of calorie counting, a lot of people, probably particularly blokes, because it seemed that the 5-2 diet worked disproportionately well on blokes. But if you can't go out once a week and have 3 pints of lager and a curry with your friends and not worry about the calorific content of the jalfrezi, your life's not really worth living, is it? I mean, you might as well just give up. And so, humans are actually, we have a certain degree of, we have a certain requirement for the odd discretionary treat. So I suddenly found the thing absolutely fascinating because, in fact, compliance, when it becomes a box-ticking, very, very procedural thing, is boring. But it's also, I would suspect, relatively ineffective because you start creating rules where, the other problem, which is a known problem in IT security, is that if you make the rules dumb, and badly written rules, in other words, rules that are written without reference to human psychology, will always be dumb in certain contexts and circumstances. Then what just happens is people just start working their way around it. The thing, we've got to replace our password for email every month. And so everybody has a password which is 1 plus last month's password. Okay, so if you find someone's password written on a Post-it note, it's only a matter of trying 100, and there's a wonderful section in the opening chapter of Henry Marsh's book on brain surgery. I don't know if you've read that.
No.
Where they need to get the x-rays of a patient, okay? And he rings up the guy and says, I can't get in to look at these x-rays. I'm supposed to be digging into his brain in sort of 20 minutes, and I can't find the CAT scan or the x-ray because it's password protected. And the guy goes, it's stupid fucking idiot 47. He doesn't work. And he goes, terribly sorry, mate. We had to change it last month. It's stupid fucking idiot 48. And you realise there are kind of, life-threatening things that are sometimes dependent on. By the way, I worry about privacy a bit because most people, I got very annoyed when Zoom added default passwords.
Oh, that's a pain in the arse.
Because I said, hold on a second, to be honest, if 1 in 50 meetings we get porn bombed,
it's quite fun.
I can't live with that, right? And you can block people, you can lock meetings. And so one of the things is that the IT mentality will always default to maximum privacy and safety. Now, actually, there's a hell of a lot of stuff. There's a cost which is imposed when you demand that everybody essentially has a privacy regime. I wouldn't mind it if my gas company emailed me my bill, okay? Because, Now, admittedly, if you're running a cannabis farm in the attic, you probably don't want to, you're on public record. But I'm not doing that anymore. And so, in various things like health and epidemiology, actually, if you allowed people to default to an easy regime for much of their health data, and then obviously a high privacy, high sensitivity regime to that data that really needs to be kept secret. It's difficult to tell in advance which is which, by the way, which is a fair point. And there's also the huge danger that employers will then start abusing something if you're not careful. But there's always this fantastic thing, which is that rules designed exclusively by economists or lawyers, which don't have reference to, I would say, an element of sort of evolutionary psychology and epistemology and just behavioural science, can often be completely self-defeating. One of the best things, and you must interview a guy called Luca Delana.
I have, yeah, he's brilliant. Yes.
And he's got another Italian colleague at a Dutch university whose name I temporarily forget.
This is Pasquale Cirillo.
Who made this brilliant observation about fence theory, which is that rules you set as a limit tend to become a target.
Right.
And so if the classic example of this is, it was intended to be a maximum £9,000 a year to attend a British university. And they set it as a maximum, assuming, as naive economists would, that there'll be a whole variety of prices. And there will be a sudden efflorescence of one-year courses costing only £4,000. Okay? No. Everybody has to charge £9,000 because otherwise you're officially admitting you're not as good as the other guys. It's rather like the fact that all CDs cost the same, basically, and all cinema tickets cost the same. Now, I mean, that is a bit of a mystery in economics, but it's because prices contain signals. They're not just an obstacle, they're also a signal of seller confidence. And if you start making, the Bond film 20 quid a ticket and the art house film is £3.50, it's kind of saying, look, if you want a really good evening, you want the Bond film. It's an interesting one, too, because if you think about it, theatre and cinema, there's a large amount of incidental cost as well. And so it's not as if you go and see a bad, cheap film. It's not as if you've had a free evening because you've probably had a meal out. You've had to pay to park. You might have got babysitting. There are a load of other costs. And so natural human logic will go, well, having spent all these other amounts of money on popcorn, overpriced popcorn, soft drinks, parking, babysitting, I really don't want this evening to be a write-off.
Right.
Which, of course, applies to education. You don't want to look as if you chose your educational course based on price.
But it's interesting when you talk in these terms and it makes perfect sense to me, but you can kind of tell with compliance, the branding of compliance is appalling, right? Which is why you wouldn't see a Mad Men type series about compliance, because nobody would even dare to watch it. Right? It aspires to precisely the opposite thing, right? Which is sort of, I don't think there's anybody who grows up wanting to join that discipline, and I for one certainly didn't. You sort of end up with it, and you make do with this title that everybody understands that it becomes loaded with negativity.
Yeah,
I mean, literally, if you were trying to come up with a piss poor piece of branding, that is what you would, and you would then add the word officer. And which has the bizarre effect of making the word compliance even worse than normal. And so it's sort of cloaked in this. And all of the things you say make perfect sense, but they're not deployed in that context. And I agree with you. I sort of, so this is how I got into this space. So I watched you and read your books and other people, and you sort of see, you go, oh my God, it's exactly the same thing. We're in the business of influencing human decision making. And yet, because of the legacy and the historical logic and the need to demonstrate sort of common, sensible approach to things and have defensible processes, you end up with this really weird outcome that is many of the things you've talked about in say the health context that we use, we don't use within organizations to manage other forms of risk.
So the classic example, I think, which is it's much more of a bias. And by the way, I'm doing a whole lot of work with LinkedIn on this, that actually behavioural science, and particularly the concept of a bias, which I'm very uncomfortable about, by the way, because quite often behaviour you would deem to be biased is because either you're comparing someone against Homo economicus, who's a species that's never evolved and doesn't exist.
There's Mr. Logic in Viz, actually, which I always think is an interesting example, because he's an arse, and therefore we know that that's not normal and not human.
No, and I mean, funnily enough, Mr. Logic was based on the brother of one of the creators of Viz. And it's a very interesting read in the book about Viz. So the brother used to get really annoyed because his father wanted to put milk in a jug. And his father just said, look, it's nicer having a milk jug on the table and having a milk bottle on the table. And the brother would go, but it's completely illogical. You're using an unnecessary receptacle in between the original milk receptacle and the cornflakes, and this is completely illogical. And the very interesting thing about that is that I think that I'm very uncomfortable talking about a bias in individual consumer decision making, because it often arises from the fact that you don't fully know the context in which someone's operating or what deep down they're trying to do. Indeed, they themselves may not even know what they're trying to do. You know, quite often the real why, as my colleague Chris Graves calls it, the real why is not only hidden from other people, it's hidden from yourself. And there are wonderful books on this about why it doesn't pay us to have full introspective understanding of Robert Triver's book, Deceit and Self-Deception, is a fantastic book on this. There's a great one by Robert Kurtzman called Why Everyone Else is a Hypocrite. And the point is that we don't even know our own motivations. I'm sure there are people who buy Porsches and go, it justified on the load bearing capacity. I mean, the reason is that if we actually knew our own motivations completely, it would be impossible for us to dissemble. And there's this wonderful example of the hare, which Trivers uses, which is when hares are chased by a dog, they kind of enter a random number sort of mode where they lose free will, and they'll just zigzag left, then right, then straight on, then they'll double back. And they themselves don't know what they're doing. And the reason for that is if a hare had any foreknowledge of its next jump, it would give away telltale signals, and dogs would have evolved the ability to read these tells in poker playing parlance. And so the self-aware hare basically got eaten, whereas the hare that had the capacity for self-deception or non-self-awareness got to survive. And so what's very interesting there is that I'm very uncomfortable about bias used in consumer decisions because, what's the person really trying to do? They don't know themselves. But in business decision-making, I think you can use the term much more liberally, or institutional, governmental decision-making, because you have this fundamental bias, which is rationality bias, which is that I would argue that just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's true, okay? You can have a very plausible explanation for something which makes sense. That does not mean that that thing is necessarily true. You can equally have things that make no sense at first that are true. Certainly they make no sense in advance. You might be able to post-rationalize them, but you aren't able to pre-rationalize them. And the Dyson or Red Bull are always the examples I give, making the case for that on a PowerPoint deck. What the world really wants is a really expensive drink in a tiny can that most people in research say tastes disgusting. Okay, I think you can post-rationalize that. Would I have invested in Red Bull initially? I'm not sure I would. One of the great things about capitalism, unlike academia, is it has a reward mechanism that if you discover something that nobody else does, you make a lot of money. So it has a real incentive for people to take high risk, what you might call high risk gambles, because the payoff is disproportionately high if you discover something that's that because it's seemingly irrational is hidden to your competitors, your much more conventional competitors. Which is why I think the Hayekian role of the entrepreneur is so essential, because he's a person who doesn't have to justify himself to a committee. Thomas Watson, the founder of IBM, when he created the PC division, deliberately tried to create this kind of entrepreneurial thing because he based the PC development division under a total wild card guy at IBM, who tragically died in a plane crash, by the way, but who wore cowboy boots. Now, bear in mind, if you're wearing cowboy boots and you're working at IBM in the 1970s, that's practically a punk. And this guy was based in Boca Raton, deliberately miles from IBM headquarters, and only reported to Thomas Watson and nobody else. Because he said, if we put you in the mainstream, you'll never do anything. So the institutional bias is really interesting, because if you do something that has a bad outcome but a good rationale, your career risk is very, very low. It'll get blamed on something else. If you do something with a good outcome with a poor rationale, you won't get very much credit, unless you're an entrepreneur, in which case you get to keep all the money. Okay. If you make something with a poor rationale and a bad outcome, you're toast. And so the bias is towards those things that we can explain and justify and quantify, rather than the decisions made that have proven to be successful. And so there's this, and by the way, I think you see it in medicine a bit, which is, I don't think we should be using p-value obsessions with certainty around treatment for COVID-ID. If there's a drug that seems to have no side effects and there's some evidence that it significantly improves outcomes, I don't think you wait for the double-blind trial. You give it to people by default, wouldn't you? Okay?
Yeah.
And that actually brings me to another really interesting area, which you must have had ergodicity mentioned. Have you on your?
Yes, yeah. I love this, but you should explain it for the listeners because I think it's a fascinating concept.
Well, I think it's interesting because what I realised, first of all, I realised an interesting thing, which is that really, really good maths. And I'm not a good mathematician at all. I did A level, but I'm not a mathematician. My brother is, and Ole patently is a fantastic mathematician. And it's very similar sometimes to advertising creativity, which is that to solve a problem, it isn't about knowing how to solve the problem. It's about knowing it's not about being brilliant at maths. It's about knowing which kind of maths to use. And you can make a problem that seems almost impossible really, really easy by reframing that problem in a different way. The other reason I think there's a similarity, and I think why ergodicity is so important, is it kind of says, actually, we look at facts as if they're universal truths, but most of the time they're kind of context dependent, okay? Most statistics contain very, very heavy biases in terms of how they're collected. So, for example, if the statistics are a series of snapshots, what will derive from that information is very, very different from if you actually have a cohort study or a time series study. So one of the really interesting things to me there is that I think marketers, interestingly, tend to think, because they tend to look at a business not through the spreadsheet perspective, but through the consumer's eye view, they tend to understand this distinction between kind of the non-ergodic thing. In other words, your average customer satisfaction doesn't matter very much if 1 time in 15 you piss off every customer massively, right? Okay?
Right.
If you have very, very high levels of satisfaction at your hotel chain, but at random on every 15th stay, you say, fuck off, okay? Okay? This is not going to be a successful hotel. Okay? And yet your average figures might look spectacular, in a parallel universe where the happiness were evenly distributed according to the ensemble average rather than the time series, okay? And, it's exactly that point that actually you could probably get 1,000 people to accept £1 million to play Russian roulette once, but you couldn't get anybody to accept any amount of money to play Russian roulette 1,000 times in a row. Okay. And so not understanding that distinction because you're very confident in the data that you currently have, and you think that the way it's collected and aggregated has no bearing on its meaning, is a terribly expensive mistake. And so this ergodicity thing, I drive my colleagues slightly nuts because I obsess about it. But one of the things I'd say weirdly as a conclusion from this whole question which Ole has raised is a very weird one, which is any company, even if it isn't principally, even if it doesn't do marketing, should have someone on the board who represents the consumer or customer point of view. And the reason is you can make decisions that make perfect. I'll give you a brilliant invention that I think arose from an understanding of the distinction between ergodic and non-ergodic. And it was one that got enormous pushback from finance and everybody else at the time. And it's Jeff Bezos' invention of Amazon Prime. Okay? And what I think Jeff realized, because at the time he launched Amazon Prime, I think he was already a billionaire, right? But he probably realized, okay, 10 people don't mind paying £3 for delivery once a month. But one person, no matter how rich he is, really minds paying £3 for delivery 10 times a month. And I've argued that you need a non-ergodic viewpoint of the world in order to solve most problems, because otherwise the only solution you can do is a solution that solves for the average. And problems that solve for the average are expensive and they're a kind of blunt instrument and they're crude. Okay? So I hope this is applicable to I think it is applicable to what you're talking.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So my suggestion, I regard Ole and Murray Gell-Mann's work on this, with Nassim Taleb, I think, grasped it as well before anybody else did. I regard it as actually an extraordinarily rich pool for creative problem solving. Now, let me be clear about my approach to behavioral science, okay? If you think behavioral science is a science which is, it tells you what to do, it's not a science. But then I don't think science is about knowing what you have to do to an absolute level of certainty and with no ambiguity. The role of behavioral science is to expand the solution set, right? The reason I think that psychology and behavioral science is very valuable is because if you give a problem to an economist, they'll try and solve for the average. They won't factor in psychology, and you'll always come up with this one economically rational, optimal solution. But the solution set that's been explored by that economist is tiny. So an economist might say, if someone breaks a compliance rule, you must fine them or fire them or punish them. He would never say, you've got to wear a hat with a penis on it for the next 3 days at work, which might be a more effective solution, to be absolutely honest. Okay? We have evidence for this because George Washington wrote about this not about a hat with a penis on, but about having to wear your wife's bonnet, that shame. Now, the reason I'm not joking there is in the airline industry, I think it principally works through shame. Okay, if a pilot doesn't report something, a near miss, and you get found out, more shame accrues to you through trying to bury something than would from actually making the mistake in the first place. So you've created a culture where there's a shame around hiding things. Now, anyway, so I'll go back to my solution set point, which is the great value of this is anything that expands the solution set is good science, in my view. And the ergodicity thing is fascinating because it says, okay, a lot of things that look problematic from one angle can be really easy looked at from another angle. Here's a nice advertising story about the agency Abbott Mead Vickers, who are told when they repitched for the Sainsbury's business, the target for Sainsbury's is to bring in an extra £1 billion in revenue for the financial year, so-and-so to so-and-so. And they all sat around as advertising people went, ooh, £1 billion, geez, And a planner at AMV, and I still don't know their name, I would repeat the name happily if I knew who it was, so if someone wants to tweet me and let me know, said, let's break this down. What that means is that everybody who visits Sainsbury's over the next few years puts one extra thing in their basket worth £1.50. And the advertising campaign arose from that is try something new today, which tapped into their heritage with high-quality cooking and the culinary arts. And so you got Jamie Oliver and various people encouraging people to be more adventurous with their cooking, which would mean essentially that you go, we better get some tarragon this week, which you wouldn't have done otherwise, right? And that's a solution. That's a simple solution which arises through not looking at the aggregate, but looking at the disaggregated thing. Looking at the time series, I would argue you can solve train overcrowding psychologically by saying you don't need longer, more frequent, faster trains. You don't need fucking train seats with seat backs like bloody ironing boards. So you can squeeze in a dismal extra poor bloody people, right? Okay, don't do that. Let's have a bit of plush. Let's have a bit of cushion. But 100 people who have to stand on a train 10% of the time aren't particularly pissed off. 10 people who have to stand on a train 100% of the time are mightily angry. If you want to minimize annoyance, not minimize standing, you look at the problem non-ergodically, okay, because we don't live in parallel universes, and you say, what we'll do is we'll run 2 extra trains a day at peak hours. Not that you need to do that now, but okay, right, okay.
Let's not do that.
Let's not do that now. But they're exclusively for season ticket holders. Okay. Or you have a rule, you make first class on commuter trains 3 times as big. Okay. And the only people that's considered first class are first class ticket holders or season ticket holders. At peak hours, first class is first class punters and season ticket holders. You have a load of first class seats now in off peak hours. What do? You sell them to us for a small premium for people who want to work, right? Because actually, when you're selling a first-class ticket, you're selling multiple things. You're selling the right to a seat at peak hours. What you're actually selling at off-peak hours is elbow room. The reason I get an off-peak first-class return on Network Southeast if I travel in at 10 o'clock is not because I want the leg room. I'm a stumpy bastard anyway. I'm going to get a seat anyway, but I really want a table with no bastard beside me so I can type. So there you go. You've got 2 solutions emerging just by flipping the way you look at things through 90 degrees. Now, the thing that terrifies me is that most data isn't of the kind that favors the what you might call the non-ergodic view of human experience. And therefore, it's epistemologically dodgy because it doesn't reflect real lived human experience over time. Okay? It doesn't reflect the fact, if you think about it, that basically, if you have a long losing streak at a casino and then win big on the last hand, you're going to leave punching the air, right? Whereas if you win massively on your first hand, lose gradually throughout the whole evening, you're going to leave feeling like a dick, okay? So the order in which things happen patently has an effect on human mood. Genuinely, by the way, if you looked at non-ergodic data in people who cheat in the city, I'd look for someone who's been given a shit mobile phone. Okay, right. I'm going to tell you this. I've worked at Ogilvy for 30 years, right? I've never really asked for a pay rise. I haven't gone greedy on anything. I'm not very sulky, right? Because I'm a bit, one of the great things about behavioural science, I kind of go, look, if you're in the top decile of wealth, okay, actually what you need, once you get into that top decile of wealth, imagination pays better than more money. Because if you can cultivate eccentric, most things are priced for people poorer than you. When I buy a 55-inch 4K telly, it's not priced for me. The Bang & Olufsen one is, but actually the Samsung one is priced for people poorer than me. My consumer surplus is huge anyway, right? Particularly in a globalized world, right? So, don't worry about all that. Actually, having real, lateral imagination about how to spend it is probably a better way to convert money into happiness than getting more money, beyond a certain point. So I work for Ogilvy. I'm not, I shouldn't say this, should I? I should say I'm extremely motivated by money because I don't want my employer to see it. But nonetheless, I'm cushy enough. I'm not that bothered. And anyway, if I get any more money, then you go in some kitchen or some pointless thing, right? Okay, I've got a Japanese toilet, brilliant, by the way.
Which, by the way, I'm a huge fan of because I don't understand why those things haven't taken off, and I love the fact that you do promo for that so well. No,
Japanese toilets, video conferencing, and a few other things, like in a way the Dyson, are the Fermat's last theorem of behavioural science. The low adoption of video conferencing has fascinated me for ages because it's a miracle. It's a superpower, right? I can conduct business at twice the level of efficiency. I gain 2 hours every day. It transforms my life. And yet most people are going, I don't really know. It's not quite. I can't believe this. My theory, my most recent theory is it went through an unfortunate development because when it was novel, it was crap. And by the time it was no longer crap, it was no longer novel. And so there was never an overlap in those two Venn diagrams where video conferencing was both novel and not crap. And so there was never a wow moment, okay? Zoom was a bit of a wow moment because you go, this stuff actually worked. But anyway, so the ergonic thing fascinates me because, so the reason I said if you're in compliance, be really wary is because I worked for Ogilvy for 30 years. Sorry, going back, I do digress. And the time in my 30 years I was most furious with my employer was when, now bear in mind, quite often people like Google and Samsung give me phones. Okay, I speak at a conference and they go, here's our latest so-and-so. It doesn't happen as often as I'd like, but it has. So I hadn't asked for a new phone handset from Ogilvy for something like 7 years. Okay, and eventually my phone, which was a Samsung Galaxy S7 or something, breaks. So I put in a request to replace it with a Samsung Galaxy S9. And they sent me a refurbished Samsung Galaxy S6. Okay. Now, this is why it's good working for a small company, because I basically went straight out to the shops. I bought a Samsung Galaxy S9. I put in the expense claim and went fucking swivel. Right? Because I was absolutely livid. And if the moment in my entire working life where I was most likely, I think, to start nicking the bog paper or, was occasioned by that ludicrously trivial moment. And so, looking at compliance and behavior, I think from a time series perspective is really, really interesting because you might find there are certain things a company does which just disproportionately lead. I make interesting arguments. I think we should bring back the company car, by the way, massively. Because electric company cars have fantastic tax advantages. But it was a way your employer signaled a longer-term commitment to you. So the bonus system, if you think about the bonus system as practiced in most financial institutions, it's inherently transactional. Okay, it says if this year you meet this target, we will give you this. It does nothing to signal that we have any long-term interest in your continued relationship with us beyond the immediate and the transactional. And this is why I think economists get it wrong, because I think they look at capitalism as if it's a series of anonymous one-shot utility maximizing exchanges. What you see under coronavirus, by the way, is it's relational. The instinctive human practice of capitalism is that when you repeatedly truck with the same person, the nature of the relationship changes and you expect more mutual trust, for example. And you will punish disappointment much more viciously if you've been a known loyal customer for a time. Most letters complaining to utilities start with the sentence, I have been a customer of yours for X years. Imagine my horror when. So patently people don't think of relationships on this kind of, wipe the slate clean every year approach. And the company card was a great way of saying, actually, I always said that the best way to prove your employer's loyalty to you was to ask for a company car that was pink, because they knew they'd have real trouble offloading it on anybody else, right? If your employer got you a pink company car, you knew they really were interested in keeping you, right? And, a pink Hummer, that would be the perfect, that would be real. That, by the way, is how investment in training mostly repays itself, because it's an it's costly signal, upfront expenses, proof of long-term intention. We are investing in you in a way that wouldn't make sense if we were planning to get rid of you at the end of 8 months.
But I think that whole idea of what pisses us off, and I think it's fascinating, because I use that as a test and say, if you want to work out which rules are most likely to be broken within an organization, go and ask people what pisses them off about compliance. Which thing really annoys the hell out of you? Because you can guarantee, especially if they're prepared to admit it, that they will be finding ways around that particular process every time they come into contact with it, because it's irritating and annoying.
I regard it as my moral duty when someone imposes a rule on me that I regard as stupid. I regard it as my moral duty to find a loophole. Yeah, absolutely. And when Zoom imposed the passwords, I was basically, okay, let's just get our own account, Or, let's start video conferencing through Pornhub. What the hell? I don't think you can do that, by the way.
It's worth checking out, though, just in case. You never know, right?
Yeah, they've probably got some great streaming technology, let's be honest, right? They're not really bandwidth constrained, I suspect.
Right, and your co-workers would be very interesting as well. But I think this is fascinating, because if I look at the majority of compliance processes, right, it's almost like somebody has designed something to be deeply irritating, because then it feels like a proper process. So let's send you on a training course that is not at all practical, but patronizes the hell out of you or bores you, or my favorite example is in banking. Everybody gets sent on anti-money laundering, and then here's a scenario, because we need to have a real life story. And the scenario is you've turned up, your client has appeared, and his half brother has appeared with a briefcase full of money.
Yeah.
Utterly ludicrous. And you kind of go, if that were to happen, I think I would recognize that as being slightly weird. That's not what I need help with. I need help with the kind of nuance, the complicated, and yet you've given me this kind of very low level thing that demonstrates you either think I'm an idiot.
Yeah.
Or you're asking me to participate in a process that is there to cover your ass, and you're pitting me in opposition to you, because you've basically told me I'm a risk to the organization and I'm not trusted.
In defense of my own employer, I think they recognize the perverse psychology of their workforce fairly well. And they do occasionally make us go through these little question and answer web pages around what is acceptable commercial behavior and what isn't. And what's quite good is the questions are quite nuancy.
Right.
So you do feel you're exercising some degree of, a few of the questions are kind of tough, as you say, someone turns up and offers you a 300-foot yacht in exchange for, it's obviously the answer yes. Fuck it. I think they're only human, right? Yeah, right, okay. But most of the questions are actually fairly well nuanced, and they're a mixture of right and wrong answers, which does at least credit your intelligence fairly well. And but there's a very interesting debate here, which is, when is persuasion better than compulsion? And it's a complicated one, because persuasion is by definition voluntary, or at least it feels voluntary. You could argue that some nudging causes you to believe you're doing something voluntarily when you weren't even aware of the context having an influence on your decision. So we'll just park that little ethical conundrum right next to the trolley bus problem, and we'll just leave that for a little bit, okay? My ethical heuristic, by the way, is if I told my late mum, would she think it was okay? Which is pretty good, actually.
Right.
If my mum wouldn't like it, I shouldn't do it. But the interesting thing is that often persuasion also is better because it allows for intelligent rule breaking. Let me explain. Okay. I have spent years, and if anybody's watching this from a utility, please can you listen to this, saying, look, the amount of carbon emitted by energy used late at night in the UK is much, much less. I mean, the UK is like half nuclear powered overnight, right? Much, much less than the amount of carbon emitted at peak times, when you might have to turn on a coal-powered power station to meet the surge in demand. Therefore, why don't you get people to put their tumble dryers, washing machines and dishwashers on at 10 o'clock at night or 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever, rather than at 5 o'clock? Not every time. If you're holding a dinner party and you're short of plates, you're going to put your dishwasher on. Doesn't matter. My job is not to get everybody to do something all the time. It's to reduce a peak. Right. Now, let's say you went to an economist. The economist would say you need to price electricity differently at different times. Okay. If you went to a lawyer, he'd need to say you need to legislate that you have to put that washing machine on after 10 o'clock. But if you simply told people and had a nice nudge, and Sky could just display a little green, yellow and red dot on the telly and say, this is a good time to use discretionary electricity. Yellow means wait a bit. Red means don't. And you just continue reminding people, and you might redesign washing machines so that by default, unless you pressed an override button, they'd leave it a few hours before they kicked off. Right? And you did all the nudgy stuff. Now, the thing is, there are always going to be a number of people who can't obey your rule or for whom the rule is stupid. So you can't put, if your next door neighbour's bedroom is underneath your kitchen, you can't put your washing machine on at midnight because it's going to hit the bloody spin cycle at 2 o'clock in the morning and wake them up. Okay? So now, if you work nights, you don't want to leave your tumble dryer on when you go off to work because it might catch fire. Right? Generally, I don't leave the time. I'm not obsessive about it. I wouldn't leave the tumble dryer on routinely when I left the house. Particularly, my wife never defluffs it. I mean, it's always easy to defluff it. But the interesting thing there is that if you persuade people, anybody with a good reason has an opt-out, which is I would do it, but next door neighbour's bedroom's underneath my washing machine.
Right.
And now, if you use economics or law, you're penalising people who have a good reason not to obey the rule. If you use persuasion, you're giving those people an opt-out. And one of the things I said is that one of the things I'd love to do is I said, don't reduce the tax rate, pay people a rebate, okay, and encourage them to donate half of it to the NHS. Maybe you can get a car sticker if you donate half. So tax cuts are stupid because after about a year and a half, you don't notice them anymore. Whereas a tax rebate would be really valuable. A, because a lump sum is fundamentally different to a Chinese water torture drip. Okay, with a lump sum, you can do something big, move house, buy a new car, whatever it might be. The other thing about that encouraged donation to the NHS is that the great thing about it is that social shame is quite intelligent. If you had a couple who weren't high earners and they had 4 kids, no one would expect them to give 50% to the NHS, right? No one's going to go, you scheme. You go, okay, you need every pound you got. I get it, right? But if you had a childless couple of double earners and they didn't give their bloody rebate to the NHS, then, you could actually, hold your lefty virtual sibling friends to account, right? And say, well, you can't ask everybody else to give the bloody money if you, who are disproportionately privileged, aren't even giving it yourself. And so the great thing is that things like human evolved instincts like shame and reputation and persuasion and so forth have a context-sensitive nuance to them, which it's very difficult in some circumstances for legislation to capture. And what's the safe speed is really, an interesting question. There's a wonderful thing I did hear. Somewhere in New Mexico, they've started, instead of having a maximum speed, they have recommended speed 50 to 70 miles an hour. And people tend to travel at about 60. If you have maximum speed 70, people travel at 75.
Right.
So the extent to which the way in which you describe something can have a big effect on behavior, because it's context that determines meaning, and it's meaning that determines emotion, and it's emotion that determines behavior. Okay. And Paul Craven, who you must interview as well, great guy, who was at PIMCO, Goldman Sachs, Schroders many years, huge behavioral science and amateur magician, brilliant amateur magician. His favorite ad, and I agree with him, is this restaurant in Saint-Emilion. Okay, and there's a lesson here for compliance people everywhere. And I don't think I would have thought of this. If you put me on a desert island and asked me to solve this problem, I'm not sure I would have come up with it in 20 years. This is how I think it's genius. So they want people to turn their mobile phones off because it's a bit of a fancy Michelin-starred restaurant. And everybody would do the same thing, on the menu, on the entrance, a sign that says, please remember to turn your mobile phone off when entering the restaurant. No, didn't do this. At the entrance to the restaurant, ostensibly targeted at people leaving, but visible to everybody walking in, was a notice that said, please remember to turn your mobile phone back on when leaving the restaurant. Now, psychologically, that is sheer genius because it's an implicit social norm. It isn't bossing me around, okay, because I have an aversion to being told what to do, especially in French, I would argue. Okay, right?
Right.
French person tells you to do something. There's a fantastic chateau in the Loire. This is a wonderful case study for perverse psychology. Brilliant chateau where there's that bridge going over the river, the gallery going over the river. And on our honeymoon, we drove there with my wife, and there was a system where the Frenchman told you where to park. So there was a guy with a whistle who pointed, so you went into car park C. Then there was another guy with a whistle who directed you towards row 2. Now, at that point, it was helpful, right? They were telling me where there were available parking spaces. And then I drive down row 2, which sure enough has some available spaces, and there's a guy with a whistle who goes peep and points at the precise space where I have to park. Despite the fact there's an empty space under a tree 3 spaces along where I could have got some shade, right? Now, weirdly, the first 2, peep, that's the guy being helpful. He's telling me where to go. The third peep, where he points at the specific space where I have to park, okay? I went into it, and I sat there, and I just said to my wife, fuck this for a game of soldiers, started the car again and drove off. It was 25 years before we visited that bloody chateau, right? Because it was over-specific, the instruction, and French. So, yeah, that's another tip. But the extraordinary thing about that message is utter genius, because there's an implicit social norm. It means that you engage in the behavior voluntarily rather than searching around for excuses to ignore the behavior. And it looks like a helpful message when, in beautifully disguised terms, it's really a kind of instruction.
And that's the bit that I think is just completely missing. And as you say, there are so many other contexts in which this stuff is done, and we are influenced to behave in very smart ways. And yet, for some reason, in the corporate environment, we can't possibly do that. And the bit that I find really bizarre is we can't possibly do that, but it's not because we know that our existing methodology is fantastic and is solving the problem. Every single person knows that it doesn't work.
Because the culture you might create in compliance is one where if I have told them to do this, my arse is now covered.
Right.
Okay. So it doesn't matter how badly you've done it, how ludicrously psychologically blind your instruction is. And this is, I think, the problem with IT, because I had this row about the Zoom password. I said, look, this is like 80% of my life. This is in physical terms. This is like locking all the meeting rooms in our office and demanding that we go down to reception and request a key, right? Okay? This is there must be now the IT guy, I'm not blaming them because in the context as an IT guy, they don't get any credit for a psychologically astute solution, and they do get the blame if the chief executive of IBM gets pawn bombed, right? So I get it, right? I get it from, and one of the things you've got to look at. But there's a great book, by the way, Gillian Tett, Silos, which is a fantastic book because one of the problems is that within any corporate silo, it has its own kind of rules and methodologies, but it also has its own priorities, which as the silo becomes more distinct, the priorities of the silo get more and more, I think, disconnected from what you might consider to be the overall good of the organization. And so we've done our bit here. I'm not responsible for the whole. I'm merely responsible for the part. And of course, any complex system can, right. There's fairly heavy interplay between the different parts.
Fabulous. We could definitively go on for hours, but I think time is creeping on us. So listen, thank you so much, one, for being inspirational and kind of just entertaining us hugely. But secondly, I think some real food for thought. And I'm reflecting on that chateau in the Loire hugely, because I think that's a brilliant example of the real world that we just carry into corporate environment without even thinking about it.
Here's the really interesting question, right? Okay, is science about looking like you're perfectly right by exploiting what you already know for sure, regardless of the limitations to that knowledge, or is it about finding out what you don't know? Now, if you look at the COVID ID release from lockdown, okay, if we only know the aggregate R0, which is the transmission rate of the virus, if there is no intervention in terms of lockdown or restriction on movement, right? The only thing we can do is lock everybody down because it's an average, therefore you have to apply rules to everybody. If we knew, however, the level of variance in R0 between both different people and different behaviours and different locations, and we could say that actually on a building site, R0 is basically 0.1, okay? But in a tube carriage or on a skiing holiday, it can be 47, right? In the worst case scenario. Then you know where you need to intervene and where you don't. And so this is why average, one of the most important lessons, which I wrote almost as a kind of, because I believe that the opposite of a good idea can be another good idea, right? And that's where marketing is distinct from, say, Newtonian physics. What we end up doing when we try and be universally right is we try and solve for the average. And my recommendation, don't solve for the average, because that assumes a degree of kind of linearity or kind of homogeneity that probably doesn't apply in most real world situations. Now, the interesting thing is there are a lot of people trying to be scientific on COVID ID with what is already known for certain. But what's already known for certain isn't really the important knowledge. We don't know whether the initial dose affects consequences of disease. There are loads and loads of things we don't know. We don't know whether a small initial dose at a different body site might lead to a far less chance of a problematic outcome, which is certainly the case with smallpox, by the way. We don't know, for example, quite a lot about, as I said, what is the actual sort of variance in R0, depending on whether you're talking about 10 people taking the tube on their way back from a skiing holiday versus, a religious festival versus, people minding their own business. I'm slightly sympathetic to those people in Trump world who go, well, locking us down and the New York subway, which may be the problem, because. And so the other one is, by the way, in terms of voluntary solutions, here's a really big one, okay? I'm a big fan of libertarian legislation, which is legislation which just gives people the right to more choice. So Helen Whately, MP for Faversham, has this really interesting idea where a company which advertises a job has to assume it's assumed that job offers flexible hours unless you state to the contrary, whereas at the moment it works the other way around. So all that's doing is increasing the variety of jobs that, by the default will offer some degree of flexible working and prevent people just lazily making the default 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. Interestingly, what was interesting about that is that it was very much aimed with women in mind, carers, but also parents. What she found was actually an extraordinary amount of support from people like middle-aged blokes. Now, one of the things I think you can do is if you legislate after COVID ID complete lockdown and you legislate to say every meeting should have a virtual option, every significant meeting should have a virtual option by default, and you're kind of free to work from home if you have a preference or a particular need to do so. Which, by the way, I think is a right we have to give employees because we don't know their individual circumstances. They may live with someone who's immunocompromised. It's not acceptable to pry into people's private lives to that extent as an employer. So I think that right. But you can legislate simply to give people a choice or to change the frame of choice, as with organ donation and managed, where the default is not no. It's do I want to? Yes, no is probably the best thing. If you can even up choice in that way, what you'll find is a large part of the problem goes away because introverts, for instance, who tend to be massively bullied in the office because everything that happens, have you noticed this? That extroverts bully introverts. You never get introverts You go, what are you doing? I don't turn up on skiing holidays and go, why don't you stay indoors and read Proust, you stupid twat? All right? You don't see me in the foothills of Everest going, I wouldn't bother climbing that thing. There'll be a queue at the top anyway. Look, here's a great book you can read in your fucking tent. Right? You never get there, okay? But the other way around, no, you've got to come. We're going shopping. No, you've got to come. We're going on a walk. Oh, no, you've got to come with us, okay? You've got to come to this meeting in Frankfurt. Well, I can just say I can have 7 productive hours by actually having a video conference with the bugger in Frankfurt, right? No, you've got to come. We're all going, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, if you just rebalance that asymmetry between introverts and extroverts, and you can just use what you might call sometimes I think you can just use legislation just to create a social norm or to remove a social stigma. And once you hit 20% of the population doing something, then the natural sigmoid curve of Bass diffusion will then take over. Getting the use of video conferencing over kind of Mount Weirdness in the initial stages might be all the legislation needs to do. But I think genuinely, for coordination purposes, for seeding important ideas, so that they might then become more widely adopted without fear of social stigma. And for I think there's a whole area of libertarian legislation, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but genuinely isn't.
Brilliant. That is a fabulous note on which to finish. Thank you so much. I will clearly put links to your wonderful book in the show notes for people. But thank you for being a pioneer. Thank you for being entertaining. And thank you for giving us some real food for thought from a compliance perspective.
It's been really great.
So that's it for another episode. And what an episode that was. As I was developing the idea of human risk, Rory was a major influence on me. So my thanks to him for helping to unleash me in this space. And of course, for appearing on the show. And my thanks to you for listening. In the show notes, you'll find links to Nudgestock, the Behavioural Science Festival he's been running for several years. Remember, it's on June the 12th, it's global, it's online, and it's free, so do join me and thousands of others in attending it. You'll also find a link to Rory's wonderful, highly recommended book, Alchemy. It's not only highly readable, but rammed with insights. And if you prefer audiobooks, I can recommend that as well, because it's read by Rory himself, so highly entertaining. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. If you've enjoyed the show, then please do leave a rating on your podcast platform of choice. That helps to raise the profile of the show, which allows others to find it, and me to continue to attract fabulous guests like Rory. If you're new to Human Risk, then do also check out the Human Risk newsletter and Human Risk video channel. Links to both in the show notes and at human-risk.com. Another episode of this podcast will be coming down this channel very soon. Because we're all in need of high-quality lockdown listening, I'm releasing episodes on a more frequent basis than normal. All that remains is for me to remind you all to stay safe and to avoid making the kind of poor decisions that will lead to you appearing in my newsletter as Human Risk in Action. Please look after yourselves, be kind to one another, and many thanks for listening.